There's a reason why 200 Comanche warriors show up at your homestead. They arrive seeking vengeance, seeking justice, or seeking battle. Thaddeus Bear Malister was on the verge of discovering their true intention. However, let's return to the beginning. A full day before this confrontation, the brutal Texas sun blazed relentlessly over Bear's cattle operation, located in the vast emptiness between Amarillo and complete isolation. When he initially noticed a small figure wandering unsteadily across his land, Bear, who was 34 years old at the time, had had his fair share of challenges while working as a rancher. Yet something about the specific dawn felt unusual, even ominous. He was fixing a broken fence post by the stream when he noticed something moving. A child, appearing no older than 8 or 9 years, was moving in erratic patterns toward his water supply. The youngster's garments were ripped, traditional indigenous clothing that had seen considerable wear. Even from his distant position, Bear could observe how malnutrition made every stride a battle. The majority of cattle ranchers in this area would have drawn their guns right away and questioned later. The relations between European settlers and native Comanche bands had remained strained for years, with attacks and retaliations keeping everyone anxious. Bear, on the other hand, had always been singular, perhaps too singular for his own good. He moved cautiously toward the child while keeping his hands visible and putting his equipment aside. Drawing nearer, he could see she was a young girl, her black eyes appearing too prominent for her gaunt face, her lips split from lack of water. She gazed up at him with a combination of terror and hopelessness that struck him like a blow to his core. The girl uttered quick Comanche phrases he couldn't comprehend, but her intent was sufficiently clear. She was famished, possibly hadn't consumed food for days. Her tiny hands pointed toward her mouth, then toward the stream, a universal communication and necessity that crossed all cultural boundaries. Bear considered his fellow ranchers about their reactions if they witnessed him assisting a Comanche child. He reflected on the alerts he'd received in town regarding recent conflicts with the tribes. He contemplated the wise choice, the secure choice. Then he gazed into those hopeless eyes once more and reached a decision that would alter everything. Without speaking, Bear lifted the girl into his arms. As he carried her toward his house, she had the impression of being almost weightless. She offered no resistance, too frail to struggle even if she had desired to. During their walk, he could sense her small frame shaking. He wasn't sure if it was hunger or fear or both. Bear seated her gently on a single chair in his humble cabin before quickly preparing food. He still had some stew from the previous evening, still warm from the stove, and some freshly baked bread from that morning. The aroma of the meal seemed to slightly revive the girl, and for the first time, he witnessed something resembling hope flicker in her gaze. While ladling the stew into a bowl, Bear noticed something that chilled his blood. Surrounding the girl's neck, partially concealed by her torn garments, was a distinctive necklace, complex beadwork, and designs he'd observed previously. His neighbor, elderly Pete Morrison, had described those precise patterns to him just the previous week. They were the ceremonial beads worn by Chief White Bull's family, the most influential Comanche leader in the area. Bear's hand stopped midway to offering her the bowl. He wasn't just assisting a starving child. If this girl was who he suspected, he was providing shelter to the man's daughter, who could effortlessly deliver 200 warriors to his door. However, it was too late to change his behavior. The girl was already reaching for the food with trembling hands, and Bear couldn't find the strength to turn her away. He gave her the bowl and watched as she ate it with the frantic hunger of a person who hadn't had food in days. What Bear didn't realize was that 20 miles distant, a Comanche search group had just discovered the girl's tracks leading straight to his ranch, and Chief White Bull himself was leading that group. His expression was a mask of rage and sorrow that promised nothing but trouble for whoever had taken his daughter. The girl completed her meal and looked up at Bear with something that could have been thankfulness. However, as the afternoon shadow started to stretch across his property, Bear couldn't dismiss the sensation that he'd just made either the finest decision of his existence or the final one he'd ever make. Within an hour, the girl fell asleep in Bear's chair, exhaustedness finally taking over her small body. Bear covered her with his only blanket and attempted to convince himself he'd acted correctly. But as evening drew near, That belief began to weaken. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt path made his stomach sink. Bear looked through his window and saw his neighbor Cletus Hartwell riding frantically toward his cabin with two other men Bear recognized from town, Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison and the local minister, Reverend Thomas. Bear stepped outside before they could dismount, hoping to keep their voices low and prevent waking the girl. However, Cletus was already yelling before his horse fully stopped. "Bear, you damn fool! What the hell are you thinking?" Cletus's face was crimson with anger and something resembling fear. Morrison here claims to have seen smoke signals coming from the hills this afternoon. The Comanche are searching for something or someone. Deputy Morrison nodded grimly. "My father sent word from town. Chief White Bull's daughter disappeared 3 days ago during a hunting expedition. Word is she wandered off and became lost in a storm." He paused, studying Bear's expression carefully. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about a missing Comanche girl, would you?" Bear felt his throat become dry. The intelligent thing would be to lie, to send them away and resolve this alone. However, these men had long been his neighbors. Despite their shortcomings, they were here out of genuine worry. "She's inside," Bear said quietly, half-starved and exhausted. "I could not simply permit her to die." The silence that followed was overwhelming. The voice of Reverend Thomas, who spoke first, was barely audible. "Son, do you have any idea what you've done?" "I helped a hungry child," Bear replied. But even as he spoke it, he could hear how innocent it sounded. Cletus began frantically pacing and combing his hair with his hands. "They're gonna think you kidnapped her." "Hell, they probably already think that. White Bull's been known to destroy entire settlements for less than this." Deputy Morrison was already backing toward his horse. "I have to report this, Bear. It's my responsibility, but I'll get you started early. Get her back to her people before they find you here." "In the dark?" Bear asked. "She can barely walk. And how am I supposed to approach a Comanche camp without getting shot full of arrows?" "That's your problem now," Morrison said, mounting his horse. "I'm riding to town to warn everyone else. If White Bull decides to make an example of you, he might not stop at just your ranch." As the three men rode away, Bear stood alone in the growing darkness, listening to the girl's quiet breathing from inside the cabin. He thought about saddling up and trying to locate the Comanche camp, but he knew it was suicide. He thought about loading her into his wagon and trying to reach the nearest town, but that would only worsen things. The truth was there was no good exit from this. Every option led to the same place, a confrontation with one of the most feared war chiefs in Texas. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new sound drifted across the plains, the distant rhythm of war drums, growing closer with each passing minute. Bear's blood turned to ice. They were not anticipating morning. The Comanche were coming tonight. Bear rushed back into cabin, his mind racing. The war drums were becoming louder, and he could now distinguish individual beats in the rhythm, slow, methodical, and absolutely terrifying. This wasn't the chaotic noise of a raiding party. This was something far more organized and infinitely more dangerous. The girl stirred in the chair, awakened by the sound of the drums. Bear recognized her face for the first time since he'd found her as she opened her eyes wide. She understood what those drums meant better than he did. She spoke quickly in Comanche and pointed first at herself and then at the door. Even without understanding the words, Bear could see the panic in her movements. She was attempting to convey important information to him, but the language barrier prevented her from communicating. Bear spoke as calmly as he could while he sat down next to her chair. "I'm trying to help you, little one, even though I know you can't understand me. Those drums, that's your people coming for you, isn't it?" After giving Bear a firm nod, the girl grabbed his shirt and pulled him toward the window. She pointed outside and held up both hands, opening and closing her fingers repeatedly. Bear counted along with her movements, 10, 20, 30. She kept going until she'd counted to what looked like 200. The bear's legs became weak. 200 warriors. He'd been hoping for maybe a dozen angry braves that he could somehow reason with. However, 200 was sufficient to level every ranch for 50 miles. The drums stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Bear walked over the window and looked out into the pitch black. At first, he saw nothing. Then, like ghosts materializing from the night itself, he began to make out shapes moving across his property. They arrived in perfect order, the mounted warriors spreading out in a large semicircle that was gradually securing his cabin. Bear could see the war paint on their faces, the feathers in their hair, and the weapons in their hands even in the moonlight. These weren't men who had come to negotiate. The girl tugged on Bear's sleeve again, this time gesturing toward herself and then toward the door. She wanted to go to them, but Bear couldn't tell if that would help or make everything worse. What if they believed he had harmed her? What if they didn't believe she'd come to him willingly? A single voice called out from the darkness, speaking in English with a heavy accent but perfect clarity. "White man, we know you have taken something that belongs to us. Send out the girl, and perhaps you will live to see morning." Bear's mouth went dry. The voice carried absolute authority. This had to be Chief White Bull himself. Bear had heard stories about the man, how he'd united several tribes under his leadership, how he'd never lost a battle against the cavalry. And now Bear was about to face him across the barrel of a conversation that could end with everyone dead. Bear stepped toward the door, but the girl grabbed his arm with surprising strength for someone so small. She shook her head frantically and pointed to herself, then made a gesture across her throat. She was trying to warn him about something. But what? Then it hit him like a lightning bolt. The young lady was not simply the chief's daughter. She was a chief's only daughter. In Comanche culture, that made her invaluable, not just as family, but as the future of the bloodline. If anything had happened to her while in Bear's care, even if it wasn't his fault, White Bull would have no choice but to make an example of him that other settlers would never forget. Bear's horror grew as he realized that saving the girl's life might have been simple. Now he had to prove to 200 armed warriors that he'd saved her, not stolen her. And he had about 30 seconds to figure out how to do that before Chief White Bull lost his patience and turned Bear's ranch into a battlefield. Bear made the most difficult choice of his life. He opened the cabin door and stepped outside with his hands raised high, the girl following close behind him. The sight that greeted him was something straight out of his worst nightmares. 200 Comanche warriors sat motionless on their horses, forming a perfect circle around his property. Every weapon was aimed directly at him, and war paint shone in the moonlight. At the front of the formation sat a man who could only be Chief White Bull. Massive, imposing, with silver streaking through his long black hair and eyes that seemed to burn with barely contained fury. The girl yelled in Comanche as she ran toward her father. But instead of the joyful reunion Bear expected, White Bull's expression grew even darker. The chief dismounted and knelt beside his daughter, examining her carefully while she spoke rapidly, gesturing back toward Bear in the cabin. Bear couldn't understand the words, but he could read the chief's body language. Every muscle in White Bull's frame was coiled like a spring, ready to explode into violence. Whatever the girl was telling him, it wasn't making things better. Finally, White Bull stood and walked toward Bear with slow, deliberate steps. The other warriors remained mounted but shifted their weapons, the subtle movement creating a sound like rattlesnakes preparing to strike. White Bull said, his English being sharp and direct, "My daughter tells me you fed her. She tells me you gave her shelter." He stopped just outside arm's reach, close enough that Bear could see the intricate scars on the chief's chest, marks of countless battles won and enemies defeated. Bear responded, his voice more composed than usual. "Yes, she was starving. I couldn't let a child die." He was the focus of White Bull's lengthy attention. "She also tells me you saw the sacred beads of our family around her neck. You knew who she was, yet you did not immediately return her to us." Bear's heart sank. This was it, the moment everything went wrong. I was going to bring her back in the morning. She was too weak to travel at night." "Perhaps," said White Bull. "Or perhaps you thought to keep her as a prize, to trade her back to us for cattle or horses or safe passage through our lands." Like the smoke from a funeral pyre, the accusation hung in the air. Bear could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on him, warriors waiting for their chief's signal to turn this conversation into a massacre. Bear stated, "That's not true. I never wanted anything from you. I just couldn't watch a child suffer. If I were you, what would you do? Would you give yourself over to a war chief who had never been kind to a white man, or stand your ground and defend your actions, even if it meant certain death. Every warrior pulled back their bowstrings in perfect unison when White Bull raised his hand. It sounded like death was taking a deep breath when 200 arrows were fired simultaneously. "You will prove your words," the chief said quietly, "or you will die where you stand." Bear's thoughts raced as he stared at the moonlit 200 arrow points. How do you prove goodness to a man who's seen nothing but evil from your kind? Then inspiration struck like lightning. "Your daughter was wearing this when I found her," Bear said slowly, reaching into his pocket. Every warrior tensed, but he pulled out a small piece of torn fabric, part of the girl's original clothing that had caught on his fence post. "I kept it because I thought you might want proof that I didn't harm her." White Bull noticed something familiar as he looked at the material. It was indeed from his daughter's ceremonial dress, the one she'd been wearing when she disappeared. Bear went on, his voice getting louder. "She came to my water source. I could have driven her away, could have shot her as a trespasser. Instead, I carried her to my home. I provided her with my own blanket and food. I asked for nothing in return." The girl spoke up suddenly, tugging on her father's arm and pointing back toward the cabin. She ran to the door and beckoned for him to follow. White Bull motioned for Bear to accompany them inside, confused but curious. In the cabin, the girl pointed to the chair where she'd slept, then to the empty bowl where Bear had served her stew. She mimed eating, then sleeping, then pointed to Bear and smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. But White Bull's attention was focused on something else entirely. On the table sat Bear's most prized possession, a small tintype photograph of his own family. 3 years ago, a cholera outbreak claimed the lives of his wife and young son. The picture was worn from handling, surrounded by dried wildflowers that Bear replaced every week. "You have lost children too," White Bull said quietly. Also, for the first time, he spoke with something other than rage in his voice. Bear's throat was tight when he said, "My boy was about her age. Maybe that's why I couldn't turn her away." White Bull took the picture and looked at the faces of Bear's family that had vanished. Outside, the warriors maintained their positions, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The girl continued chattering in Comanche, apparently telling her father every detail of how Bear had cared for her. White Bull interpreted. "She says you could have taken advantage. A lone white man with a Comanche child. You could have used her as protection or demanded a ransom. Instead, you simply fed her and let her rest." Bear nodded. "Chief, I have nothing against your people. I just work my land and try to live in peace." While still holding the picture, White Bull remained silent for some time. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone, including his own daughter. "My warriors expected to find a kidnapper tonight. They anticipated burning this location to the ground and returning your scalp as evidence of our justice." He set the photograph down carefully. "Instead, we find a man who treated a child who could have been his enemy with kindness." Bear felt hope flickering in his chest, but he could also hear restless movement outside. 200 warriors had come here for blood, and their chief was talking about kindness. A different kind of violence could quickly emerge from that kind of disappointment. But there's still a problem. White Bull continued, and Bear's hope crumbled. "My warriors cannot return empty-handed. They cannot tell their wives and children that we rode out to punish a crime and came back with nothing but words." The Bear's blood became cold. "What are you saying?" "I am stating that despite the fact that you intended no harm, you have created a circumstance that necessitates resolution. My people expected justice tonight, and if they don't get it..." White Bull gestured toward the door, where the sound of increasingly agitated voices could be heard. "Some of my young warriors believe that any white man who touches a Comanche child, for any reason, must pay the price. They think I am being weak by talking instead of fighting." Outside, someone shouted in Comanche, and the sound was picked up by other voices. Bear couldn't make out the words, but the voice was clear. They were calling for blood. White Bull looked Bear directly in the eyes. "There is only one way to satisfy both justice and honor tonight, but it will require something from you that may be harder than dying." Broken Arrow, a warrior, crossed White Bull's path right away. He spoke quickly in Comanche, his voice rising with each word, his scarred face twisted with rage. Bear didn't need a translation to understand the challenge being thrown down. White Bull's response was quiet but firm, and Bear watched as the two men faced off. Chief against warrior, authority against grief-fueled anger. Bear could feel the girl shaking as she pressed closer to his side. Other warriors began choosing sides, some moving behind Broken Arrow, others remaining loyal to their chief. The careful discipline that had marked their arrival was starting to fracture, and Bear realized he was witnessing something that could split the tribe apart. Broken Arrow pointed his lance at Bear and shouted something that made several warriors nod in agreement. White Bull's jaw tightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of a final warning. But Broken Arrow wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, close enough now that the point of his lance was almost touching White Bull's chest. The challenge was obvious. Stick to the old ways of trading blood for blood, or risk being viewed as weak by the younger warriors. That's when the girl did something that no one expected. She moved in between the two men and spoke quickly and passionately in Comanche. Her young voice cut through the tension like a knife, and Bear watched as Broken Arrow's expression shifted from rage to confusion to something that might have been shame. White Bull translated quietly. She is telling them exactly what happened, how she got lost in the storm, how she wandered for days without food or water, how she thought she would die by herself on the prairie until you found her. The girl continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. She mimed eating and sleeping before pointing to Bear and then herself. She was telling the story of her rescue, and Broken Arrow was being heard by even the warriors who had been supporting him. Now she is telling them about your family photograph. White Bull continued, about how she could see the sadness in your eyes when you looked at it. She is saying that you helped her because you understood loss, not because you wanted to hurt our people. Broken Arrow lowered his lance slightly, but his face still showed doubt. He spoke again, this time directly to the girl, and Bear caught one word he recognized, Wasatchu, the Comanche term for white man and not a friendly one. The girl's reaction was swift and ferocious. She stepped closer to Broken Arrow and spoke with such intensity that several warriors actually stepped back. Whatever she was saying, it was having an impact. She is asking him if he has children. White Bull translated, surprise evident in his voice. She is asking him what he would want a stranger to do if his child was starving in the wilderness, he says. The lance of Broken Arrow fell to his side. The woman was still not done. She continued speaking, now addressing all the warriors in their immediate vicinity. Bear could see the crowd's reaction as the hardened faces began to soften. She is telling them that judging you for your kindness would make us no better than the soldiers who kill without asking questions first. She is saying that if we punish mercy, we become the monsters that the white man believes us to be. After that, there was a deafening silence. The words of an 8-year-old girl who had just challenged their deepest beliefs about justice and vengeance were processed by 200 warriors as they sat motionless. Finally, Broken Arrow spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. White Bull's translation came slowly. He says that perhaps the spirit sent his brother a teacher instead of an enemy. He says that maybe wisdom sometimes comes from the smallest voices. Bear sensed a shift in the atmosphere all around them. Although the tension was still present, it had changed into something else. Perhaps uncertainty or the beginning of comprehension. White Bull looked at Bear with something that might have been respect. My daughter has just done something remarkable. She has made a council meeting out of a war party. But now comes the hardest part. What's that? Now you must prove to them that her faith in you is justified. Tonight, in front of elders who have long harbored hatred for your people in our village. White Bull made a horse-related gesture. Are you ready to bet your life on the word of a child? Bear turned to look at the girl, who was staring at him with the same frantic eyes that had started the whole ordeal. He realized, however, that she was not pleading with him this time. She was giving hers away. And somehow, that made all the difference. Bear spent 3 hours traveling to the Comanche village through terrain his people had never seen before, including hidden canyons and secret routes. As they approached the camp, Bear could see dozens of fires flickering in the darkness and hear the low murmur of voices as word spread of their arrival. The tribal council convened immediately, despite the late hour. Around a central fire, 7 elders sat in a semicircle, their weathered faces grave in the dancing shadows. Bear stood in the middle, acutely aware that he was probably the first white person to enter this sacred space and survive. White Bull began by describing the circumstances surrounding the rescue of his daughter. Then came Broken Arrow, who, despite his earlier change of heart, still argued for traditional justice. Bear didn't understand much of what was being said in Comanche for what seemed like hours, other than occasional gestures in his direction. Finally, the girl stepped forward again. This time, her voice was calm and measured, but her words carried the weight of absolute conviction. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, never once looking away from the elders' faces. When she finished, the oldest member of the council, an ancient man whose hair was completely white, asked her a single question. Her answer was immediate and unwavering. White Bull turned to Bear. He asked her if she truly believes you would risk your life to save a Comanche child again, knowing what it might cost you. She said yes without hesitation. The elders conferred among themselves in whispers. Bear's heart pounded as he waited for their decision, knowing that these next few moments would determine whether he lived or died. The older man with white hair stood slowly, his joints creaking from age. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades of wisdom. He says, White Bull translated, that the spirits have sent us a test tonight, not a test of our ability to make war, but our ability to recognize when mercy deserves mercy in return. Bear felt his knees go weak with relief, but the elder wasn't finished. You will be granted safe passage back to your land. But more than that, you will be granted the protection of our tribe. Any Comanche who harms you or your property will answer to this council. Bear could barely speak. I don't know what to say. Through White Bull's translation, the elder continued, there is one condition. You must promise that if any of our people come to you in need, hungry, wounded, or lost, you will show them the same kindness you showed this child. I promise, Bear said without hesitation. Everyone was surprised by the subsequent event. The girl ran to Bear and hugged him tightly, speaking in broken English for the first time. Thank you for saving me. Now I save you. As dawn broke over the prairie, Bear rode back to his ranch with an escort of honor instead of a war party. One cowboy's simple act of kindness had instead provided a bridge between the two cultures, which had been on the verge of violence. Bear's ranch became a neutral location where settlers and Comanche could safely meet. He never became famous or rich, but he lived the rest of his life knowing that even the smallest act of kindness can sometimes save lives. And every year on the anniversary of that night, a young Comanche woman, no longer a starving child but a respected member of her tribe, would visit Bear's ranch to share a meal and remember the moment when two worlds chose understanding over warfare. The girl who had once begged for food became a translator and peacekeeper between the tribes and settlers. Bear lived to the age of 73, and he passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by friends from both cultures who had learned that courage does not always require fighting. Bear had lived to that age. Knowing when to feed a hungry child instead is sometimes the key. If you're loving these incredible true stories from the Old West, hit that subscribe button, because we got so many more tales of courage, conflict, and unexpected heroes waiting for you. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with twists so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon.